Holy moly, it's 4:00.
Howdy.
Karen,
We're still
what
waiting
are we
on
missing?
Tom and Frank.
Tom and Frank. And do we have the Scotts available?
One Scott Camphart, and we're waiting for Scott Frago. Oh, Frago's here. Tom is joining, so we're still waiting on Frank. Hey, Ben, good to see you. We'll have you pop on when your agenda item comes up. Cool? No worries.
Sounds good. Hi, Layla. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you need me to pop off or are you going to kick me off?
Yeah, if you would mind just until the agenda item, just turning your video off.
Copy that.
We have our Hollywood squares all dialed in. Thank you.
Well, I think we have a quorum. So I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order, and we'll hope Frank catches up when he arrives. First item on the agenda is the approval of minutes from July 17 and July 31. Have all the commissioners received and read the minutes? And are there any additions, corrections, subtractions? Anything of note? Yeah, go ahead, Bert.
Yeah, just there's two spellings of Bert, B-U-R-T and B-E-R-T. So if we can be consistent and get it to B-E-R-T, that'd be swell.
Okay. We had a former member last year that was B-U-R-T. So
okay. Well, he's still hanging around, I guess.
He's still hanging around, but we'll change it to you. Is there more than one place that was?
It was in a couple spots at the beginning of each set of minutes. So just once at each set of minutes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
That's
any other corrections? Okay, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the July 17 and July 31 meetings.
So moved.
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay, they are approved. Thank you. Let's see, we have audience participation. I wonder if there are any members of the audience that want to say anything briefly?
Karen, I do not have any hands raised at this time.
Okay, thank you, Scott. The voice from the ether. Voice with no face attached. Okay, then in that case, I'm going to turn this over to staff to talk about the next steps on the transportation system plan.
Sure. So just wanted to give folks an update where we're at with that. I think the Planning Commission was provided a memorandum that includes a summary of the proposed ordinance changes that would implement the policies included in the transportation system plan. So to ask you to study that, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'll try to help answer some of those questions and help move us forward with that. As far as the TSP process. On October 4th, the City Council will be holding its first public hearing on the adoption of the TSP. I'll actually be sending notice to the Department of Land Conservation and Development this week to get that process rolling for a post-adoption plan amendment. So the first reading will be held October 4th, the second reading November 8th, assuming City Council approves those. The ordinance will go into effect 30 days from the 8th of November. We anticipate Planning Commission to hold its first hearing on the zoning ordinance changes to implement the new policies. We're targeting that for our October meeting. Ideally, we would recommend adoption to City Council in November. And if we can, we'll do that actually in September if we have the possibility to start talking through some of those as well. So then staff will prepare an ordinance for review and approval by City Council we're anticipating that will happen in December or January. It takes 2 readings before an ordinance can be approved by the City Council. So it will go into effect 30 days after the second reading. So the earliest we anticipate the ordinance changes to be in effect will be likely February or March. And that just depends on how quickly you all run through that. I did want to note that the ordinance has really been fully vetted. So just so folks know, when we got our grant for the TSP, that also included a pretty in-depth analysis of our existing zoning ordinance, and the consultant that was hired to do that work made a number of ordinance changes to implement those policies. And so that's what's summarized in the memorandum that you have. So you'll have more than a month to review that. And again, staff would just request any questions, comments in advance so that we can be prepared to have a productive discussion about those and advance those ordinance changes as efficiently as possible to the City Council. I'd be happy to take any questions on that if anyone has any.
I have a first question. Layla, we need to do a Measure 56 notice for this. Is that why it's going to, I think it's Measure 56, why we're looking at October?
So, and Scott Breganesi can correct me if I'm wrong, but not in this case, because these are transportation amendments, so we're not actually affecting any of the land use. This is a requirement from DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, to notice them that we are proposing an amendment to the comprehensive plan, and that requires a 35-day advance notice. And that has to include the ordinance, which is now with the city attorney. I drafted it in the last couple of weeks, and so that's being reviewed. And then once that's prepared, like I said, I'm planning on doing it this week. The latest we have to notice DLCD to have a hearing in October would be August 30th.
Let's see, just got a few questions. One is that it's an advancement of kind of existing ordinance, right? And so conceptually, it continues the pattern of the existing ordinance rather than step back and say, well, what is the nature of the zoning ordinance comprehensively for the city of Manzanita? For example, is it a form-based code and kind of that groundwork for the structure of the code? And so I have a couple questions, and obviously the urgency to advance the transportation section of the code, independent of the land use categories or those kind of items. If through the process, different categories are developed, for instance, of land use that reflect the goals of the comprehensive plan, would then there be the opportunity to come back and revise this section of the ordinance, for instance, to be more integrated with a comprehensive approach?
That's a good question. So again, these ordinance changes are focused specifically on transportation. So it is not a comprehensive update of Manzanita zoning ordinance. We need to get through the comprehensive plan policy work first. And then the next step would be the implementation of the comp plan, which could include the addition of new zoning categories. I think a good example of, you mentioned form-based, a good example of that would be if we are awarded the grant from DLCD for housing, that potentially would be a complete rewrite of the residential elements of our zoning ordinance, which could take the form of a form-based code. So I want to make sure folks understand there's kind of two separate things going on here. There's one, which is policy, and that's the update of the policy language, and that's what the comprehensive plan update is. And separate from that is the implementation of the comprehensive plan, which would be the alignment of the zoning ordinance with the policies. So we have to do the policies first, then we can update the remainder of the zoning ordinance once we've completed, for example, as you mentioned, the land use element goal 2 of the comprehensive plan. So that's why it takes so long to get these things done.
Yes, it takes quite a while. Well, there are some elements of the transportation plan that do affect the character and pattern of development in Manzanita. And so I think it would be good for the the Planning Commission to make sure that any specific items in that, for instance, maximum block length, which seems really big to me, a few items like that which might want to be adjusted to reflect more contemporary thinking about community development in terms of block pattern and walkability and bikeability and some of those kind of things. So would it be that we would want to adjust those elements, the small elements, now, or come back and adjust them at a future date?
Well, I think we can't project what the land use discussion will be with the community yet. So I think if there's things that are unclear, that it would be better to wait until we have had those community conversations and develop policies. If there are policy adjustments that you see in reading the document now that are clearly reflected in the TSP, this would be the appropriate time to make some of those adjustments.
Okay, so maybe the process is we should review those and then send those along to you and then have an opportunity in the next meeting to talk about them or something like that.
Yep, that's
Okay.
exactly right. Yeah.
All right, super.
Great questions. Thank you.
Any other questions for staff on the TSP? Okay, I, for one, am really looking forward to getting moving on this. It's exciting. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is a recommendation to council to approve or not the annexation of about 2.6 acres of the property that's now part of the Manzanita transfer station within the urban growth boundary. And it's a little different than our usual items because we don't have a specific process in our ordinance for annexations. But it makes sense for us to take a look at this because it does affect land use, have an opportunity for the public to comment if they wish before we make a recommendation to council, who will then make a final decision. I don't know that we need to follow our usual procedure. Do we have members of the public that are here? I can't tell from.
We do have Justin Weiss here. I'm the interim program manager for Tillamook County Solid Waste.
Okay. I guess that's it. So staff or county, whichever of you wants to do a little presentation.
Yeah, Justin here. I can go ahead and do a little presentation and kind of lay out what we're looking at. And I'm not sure if I can share my screen, but I do have a map of the facility and kind of where the city limit does cross, so if that's possible.
Justin, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. Yeah, there we go, Scott. I think we've got it. All right, can everyone see the map, or are we still looking at me?
Yep, got it.
We can
Okay.
see the map, Justin.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, Karen. Yeah, so Tillamook County currently owns the property located at 34995 Kearney City Road. And following its closure as an open dump site, the site was converted into a transfer station and recycling center, which the county has operated since at least 1953 is what our records show. And so we've been going through some construction as of late. As I'm sure many of you know, we did a little expansion, added a couple more Z-walls for capacity for garbage and yard debris, put some more canopies up to protect garbage from water contamination and runoff and such. And we were just getting more garbage coming in, so we needed to increase our capacity. And going through that planning process, we did have to go through the county permitting process and go before the Board of Commissioners on a number of items. And then we also had to work with the city of Manzanita to approve some of the permitting there as well. So we're about halfway done with our construction. We do have another project plan for what we're calling the east wall, and it's shoring up where everyone used to drop off yard debris. That wall is failing. We need to secure that for public safety and to keep our capacity up. And so we're going to be looking to put that bid out for construction here at the end of the year. But we're asking the Planning Commission today to approve the recommendation of annexation of the property. And as you can see on the map, the the northern third is part of the city limits, and then there's a sliver, the bottom quarter is in the urban growth boundary. So the line runs right down the middle of the transfer station there, basically. And so we're asking today that the Planning Commission would recommend that the portion of the county property be annexed into the city, and this will allow for a more seamless and easy permitting process to just run all of our building permits and things of that nature through the city of Manzanita instead of doing double work and running that through the county. And this proposition was approved by the County Board of Commissioners in early July, so they have signed off on it. So now we're turning to the city for your approval and kind of pushing this process along to annex portion of the transfer station. So happy to answer any questions if anyone does have any. Thank you.
Staff want to give your recommendation?
You want me to go, Layla?
Please. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I just, for me, this makes a lot of sense. It's odd to me that there's a tax lot that is split halfway through in the city and not in the city. So we would just work closely with the county and to make sure that we could make this happen. So to me, I think it's a no-brainer, and staff's recommendation would be to recommend the annexation of the transfer station.
Any questions from commissioners? Go ahead, Bert.
Oh, just a question. Is there any risk or liability that comes with the movement of it to the city? That's one question. And then the other question would be any economic impact one way or the other to the city?
So I'll jump in on that. So no, because it's a county, it's a local government, so they don't pay taxes. So there's no benefit to us in that sense. And then I don't see any risks associated with that. I will say that we've actually had a couple incidences at the transfer station that took place on the county side, and our police couldn't respond because it was in the county. So it just makes it a little cleaner. And so I don't really know what, if any, downside. It will make the land use process more efficient for the county as well, because right now with that dual split, like Justin mentioned, they had to go to the county commission and they had to go through some other separate processes that we would actually just be able to manage that.
So any contamination or anything would be the county's
Correct.
issue. Got it.
Yes.
Bill, you had your hand raised a minute ago.
Yes, Karen. Does the maintenance responsibility change on Dump Road?
No, I don't believe so.
No, so part of when we went to the city for the new permits for the expansion, we are going to be paving and expanding the road. That was agreed upon. So there's gravel down as of now. And I've been talking with my supervisor, public works director, about getting the asphalt down. So we're going to widen the road. And based on looking at the land use map For the county, there's a small portion which falls only within the county. I think maybe the first third of Dump Road, and then the rest is within the city limits. So yeah, as Layla mentioned, I don't think it would change anything, but the county is moving towards expanding that road to allow for traffic to more easily enter and exit the facility.
That facility doesn't have a sewer hookup, does it?
Does not. No. We have water coming in from the city point down at the gate, and we just recently acquired a stormwater permit with the Department of Environmental Quality. But no sewage on site.
Okay, so if a sewage hookup becomes an issue later on, who's responsible for it? Is the city of Manzanita?
The county would be responsible for that to serve their own property.
Okay, thank you.
John, we can't hear you. Could you unmute yourself and start
All right.
over? No worries.
Are there any environmental monitoring requirements for that facility? And is it the responsibility of the county, or will any of that fall to the city?
I don't believe any of that would fall on the city. We are going to be required for our new stormwater permit to do sampling, I believe, twice a year. So we'll have a south point and a north point, and we'll be putting in some bioswales as part of the project to actually filtrate any processed water that is leaving the county property here, the transfer station. So we'll be doing some sampling for that. And then we are also going through a state environmental review process because we are tapping into some DEQ funds for the construction. And so they do require a full environmental review. We've had to reach out to the tribes. We're having to look at land use. Have there been any farms in the past? So we're doing that environmental review, which I can share with the city as well. It'll have a wealth of knowledge. But I think going forward, yeah, the county will be responsible for any monitoring or permitting and things like that.
So none of that will fall back to the city.
No, this is
Okay.
county property, so they're 100% responsible for what happens on their property. And the Department of Environmental Quality oversees the environmental aspects of the site.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah. If I could follow up on that, in my practice, I do a lot of work involving environmental liability, especially under CERCLA. And one of the few things I know from that is that any owner of property where there's contamination is responsible for the cleanup, regardless of fault. So if you acquire some property that is contaminated, you become responsible for cleaning it up. And so I'm wondering if the city should wait to obtain this piece of property until completion of the environmental review that was just suggested. Because if it turns out that there is contamination there from stuff people have been draining to the dump, asbestos, for example, by becoming owner, you become liable for it. Even if it wasn't, you weren't the one that put it there. I understand there's some convenience administratively to having it all in one authority, but I think there's some potential liability that would follow if it turns out to be contaminated and it is a dump.
Well, isn't the ownership still going to be the county? The jurisdiction becomes the city.
Is that all? That I guess I don't understand annexation. That it's still owned by the county.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. It might help. So what the problem is right now, the city limits goes through half of the site. So their tax lot is actually both in the city and in the county. So the annexation would be just to change the city limit boundary to include that entire tax lot. The county would continue ownership and still be the property owner. It would just be that the entire tax lot would now be part of the city rather than partially in the county.
Well, I guess my knowledge of environmental liability doesn't go so far as to know whether annexation would trigger responsibility as well.
I wouldn't assume it would. I would assume that the property owners would be liable, just as if it were a private property owner that was within the city limits. The city would not be liable for that cleanup.
That's correct. We don't have any ownership responsibility of the site. It's just being annexed into the boundary.
And I'm going to throw something out there that really isn't related to the annexation, but I have a pretty extensive knowledge of that property, having operated it for many years as a director of CARDM. And there was an EPA study done maybe 6 years ago, something like that, where runoff was tested. It was tested for runoff, for VOCs, and the report came back astonishingly good, that they didn't find migration of nasty materials down in the lower part of the property next to the Kearney City Road, where you would think that rainwater would have pulled things. It was a fairly clean report, so I don't. And maybe Justin, you can speak to that. You probably read it as well. It sounds like it's a scary thing, but it's actually for a dump site, it's actually okay. I don't know if that helps with it, any fears about environmental issues, but it was surprisingly good.
Yeah, Karen, I don't have any intimate knowledge of the DEQ report, but we did, for the first phase of construction, do some boring samples at, I believe, 4 or 5 locations across the western area of construction, and they came back, as you mentioned, Karen, surprisingly clean. They didn't actually discover much trash buried there, and I'm not sure the extent of the testing, but it was a fairly clean bore sample in terms of contamination and things. So, and I think the liability would still remain with the county as the property owners. So that's my understanding as well.
Yeah. Anything else on annexation? Any further questions? I would entertain a motion then with a recommendation to council.
Yeah, I'll move that the annexation be recommended to the council.
I'll second.
Thank you, John. Any further discussion? It's been moved and seconded to recommend annexation to council. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Okay, next we have a proposed project discussion, and this is a fairly free-form discussion item. There's a project that developers would like to bring to Manzanita. And this is an interesting way for the developers to talk about the project without committing to any specific design. It's really to get a feel from the community how a project of this nature might go forward. And I don't know, is Rick here? Is Rick or Jim going to talk about this, or?
Yes, Karen, I'm here, and so is Ben Prey, who is part of the Greenlight Home First people who would actually be the developer of the units and whatnot. So we thought, with everyone's permission, we actually have a PowerPoint presentation that will give you some better idea of what we're thinking, and we're here essentially, just as you said, Karen, to solicit thoughts and feelings and whatever is possible to try to figure out which direction we would go. So to get started, Ben's pulling up the presentation. We've named this thing Manzanita Pines, and those of you who have been involved for a while will recall that when Jim and I, as part of Encore Investments, first approached the city about the property that we have, We really wanted to build a master plan that encompassed a number of different styles and types of homes that served a different segment, all different segments of the population. That plan, as we all know, did not get approved, and we started doing things in pieces, the first of which was Highlands at Manzanita. You all know about that. Having started that and working it toward completion, we turned our attention to what else was necessary to try to use this land, which is a significant portion of the available residential land in the city, to solve whatever problems need to be done and to figure out how we keep true to our original concept that we wanted to have varying types of homes for varying types of folks. I won't bore you with the long story, but a number of things have happened over the last year and a half or so while we were trying to put this together, and we found Home First Development, Greenlight Home First Development, who have a stellar reputation. We did some work with them. We've had many conversations. We've visited their establishments, and we are quite proud, frankly, to have them as partners. So, with your permission, I will go through the issue and our proposal for solving it. Understanding, of course, that this is not a pre-application, as you said, Karen, but you also know us, Jim and I certainly, and we and our partners are the same way. We like to give you the details. So if we go into too much, I apologize, but we can't get detailed answers without giving detailed questions. So here we go. So the idea is why Manzanita and why now? I think I've explained. Jim and I feel a responsibility as owners of a significant amount of available land to help solve problems such as this. And the problem was defined very well through the Tillamook County Housing Needs Analysis done in 2019 about high land and development costs, and how that hampers financial viability for the middle housing group. And I should emphasize, this is not Section 8 housing we're talking about. This is what is commonly called workforce housing. And Tillamook is tied for the second highest rate of economically distressed households in Oregon. Now, that was at 2019. I can't address whether or not that's true 4 years later, but it still goes to the fact that we need to have some sort of affordable places to live for those working folks. I don't have to tell anybody in the city what that has done with businesses in the city and the changes, everything from the pizza place closing its dining room to businesses leaving the city, et cetera. And I have a quote in here about every industry in the county is impacted by the lack. Again, that's almost a Captain Obvious statement, so apologize for that, but nonetheless, it's true. The other thing that we want to go over is the fact that 1 in 4 workers, according to that study, drive over 50 miles one way to work, and that is just basically due to housing. One of the things that Jim and I, in our original village proposal back in 17, I believe it was, were very keen on is having something where people who are working in the community can walk or bike to work. You may know Jim is very involved in the whole trails discussion in the city, and that is with very good reason. We're very big on trying to reduce the amount of traffic, and to solve this problem by bringing people in from the outside is certainly a way to do it. It also contributes more to traffic, and we would rather not do that if we can find a way to do that. So, Ben, why don't you hit me again? Let's go to the next slide. To do that, and to do it the way we would like to do it, you need to have the land. There are other ways to do it. You could do infill, as the city of Portland is currently doing, and in other areas. We feel that since when Jim and I were doing an assessment of the land that we are responsible for developing, we found what we thought was a perfect location to do this. That is, and it's outlined here. I'm moving my cursor. Ben, could you move your cursor over there? Mine isn't going to do a lot of good. That is the highlighted area, and that is the far eastern, northeastern side of the property that is outlined there. It backs to a hillside that is treed and lies in an area that is segregated from the rest of the property by trees, and in the case of Highlands at Manzanita, 2 current meadows and a berm that is also treed. So we felt that it's serene, it's very nice in there. It's a place that people could be proud to live, and it's also a place that gives them their own space and a place where they can raise a family, they can start their career, whatever it happens to be, in a place to be proud of. And that's important to all of us, Jim and I, and also Ben Prey and Rob Justice from Greenlight Home First. So that is the location. You can see Nacarne City Road there, and you can also see the outline. It's, as I say, the property to the north, if you want to put your cursor up there with that green belt, is the Conservancy. That is the property that is very, again, it's very quiet, it's very serene, and it's just a great place to put it. Okay, Ben. This is we snapped some shots of the location so we could give you a better idea of what's there. And if you start from the left to right, the building location shows that Clipper Court would be the next closest street, and it is actually up a hill on a treed slope. The slope itself would not be part of the development. We would leave that in place. And the idea is that it creates a very nice buffer. And it also there's a significant height difference between this property and where the next residential property would be located. On the right, you'll see another line of trees. We would try to leave as many of those as possible. Those of you who have visited Highlands know that we really, even when we sell a lot, we don't cut the trees on the lot. We leave that to the owners because we'd like to see as many of those stay as possible. Moving from to the larger picture in the center, that is the meadow to the west of where the development would be. Putting that in perspective with residential, there's a line of trees to the right of that photo. To the west of those trees is another meadow. The west side of that second meadow has a berm and more trees on it, and then you've got the Highlands development. So you're pretty separated from what we have developed and worked on in Highlands. And then finally, the small picture in the upper right is a view to give you an idea of what the trees and whatnot looking from this location to Clipper Court would be. The ground slopes up pretty sharply there, and the trees create a nice buffer. And we have a slide later that Ben will share that talks a little bit about elevation, of what that elevation difference happens to be. Okay, Ben. So that is the why and the where. Let's talk about the what. So what is this thing we're calling Manzanita Pines? I believe you may have received the flyer that's shown here. That's kind of a big 10,000 foot view, 20,000 foot view. But it's a community that is targeted at the middle housing renter, and the intent is it is built in an aesthetic to complement the city and the surrounding areas, including Highlands. And I think you'll get a better feel for that when Ben gets to his portion of the presentation. We had an opportunity to visit the open house and inaugural party, if you will, for a development that they did in Tillamook. And Jim and I, for those of you who know us, we're pretty picky. In fact, we're very picky, and we really take, being ex-manufacturing guys, we take quality control pretty seriously. And I have to say, we didn't we didn't really find anything that we would pick apart, which frankly surprised the living daylights out of us because that normally doesn't happen. But nonetheless, we were pretty excited. And when we talked to Ben and Rob about it, their comment was, "Oh yeah, that's great. Wait till you see what we're going to do in Manzanita if we get approved." So we're highly confident that the aesthetic of what we're talking about is going to be quite pleasing, and that's important because we want Manzanita to stay Manzanita, and I think that that's an important piece of it. And the fact that it's in a very nice treed hillside, sitting on the east side of it. To the north of it is the Conservancy property. There's a buffer, and then there's Conservancy property. It really is a beautiful location. The thought process right now is that it's built in 2 to 3 phases. Phase 1 is the one that we're really talking to you about and getting ideas now, because we would like to apply for that this year. It is built in a cluster of multifamily buildings. Ben will go into that a little bit more. Phases 2 and 3 are in the design stage. The thought process there is a 2 to 4plex buildings, a little bit more, getting more akin to another product, if you will, that doesn't exist in the development right now and on the property. So we have multiple types of products for multiple types of individuals or families. And again, it is targeted at the working individual and will be deed restricted for that purpose. The last thing we need is to build something really nice and have somebody come in and start managing it for short-term rentals and or managing it to increase, something so they can sell it. We don't want to do that. What we're doing here, we want, what goes into workforce stays in workforce. And also, in order to keep it that way, there will be no short-term rentals allowed anywhere on the property or in this development. They will all be long-term rentals only and will be monitored for compliance by an on-site management, which is, again, something Ben will go over in his portion of the presentation. Okay, Ben. To do this, back to the housing needs analysis that the county commissioned in 2019, they stated that in order to incentivize it, essentially the county, the state, and the city, the local cities, need to be in partnership. When Jim and I were putting together the village at Manzanita, I had a number of conversations with the then city manager, and the way that we put it is everyone needs to have skin in the game. And we believe that that's true here as well. Now, skin does not mean necessarily a checkbook. We understand that there have been incentives that the city has discussed and put in place and looking at, and we absolutely look forward to those discussions. But relative to the financing of all of this, Ben will go into that as well, but that will basically come from the state and other areas. The cooperation relative to what we would need from all of you and the help that we hope to get are on some items: height restriction, density, zoning, that sort of thing. The property is currently zoned R2. We cannot build multifamily units on this property, and yet it's the perfect property to do that. So there is more discussion that needs to take place, and frankly, we need your help and thoughts about that possibility. Jim and I, there's multifamily allowed on our property, but it would be something that would be down, for example, at the corner of Classic Street and Nacarne City. And frankly, we just don't think that's the right place to do it. We like the serenity and the location of this property a lot better. Okay, Ben. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my portion of that. When Ben is finished and the questions start, assuming there are questions, I am absolutely happy. I will tell you that this is something that Jim and I take pretty seriously. We really want to do this. The report said there was a shortage in 2019 of 60 units for just Manzanita, and that was 4 years ago. It is I don't have to go on about problem is, you all know probably better than I do. It is a problem. Jim and I are really excited about the possibility to solve this problem and do it now, not put something in, okay, well, we'll get 10 here and 10 there. We want to solve it. We want to get it done. So we hope that you'll partner with us and help us understand what it is that we can do or should do. And I think you'll be convinced by the time Ben is done that we've found the perfect partner to do this. So with that, Rick shuts up and Ben takes over.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I'm Ben Prey. I'm an owner of Home First Development. And I'm representing a partnership between my company, Home First, and Greenlight Development. We're two developers that came together just to build affordable and workforce housing together throughout the state, given that it's obviously a major challenge statewide, in rural areas, urban areas, and everywhere in between. So right now, as a partnership, we've got more than a dozen different developments that we're working on under construction or being leased or that are fully occupied together. And we're really interested in trying to make this work in Manzanita. It will not be easy, separate from the work you have to do as a city to decide what you want in your city. Just getting anything financed right now in this economy and the challenges in the financing world are hard. So this is a challenging opportunity, but we're really excited about it, and we've loved our work so far. I'm excited to kind of start to sketch this with you and figure out, what you think. So quickly about us, we've got about 270 units right now in our pipeline. We're building right now 515, and we've built about 1,000 together. So this is something that we're very focused on, and we think we're getting pretty good at it. It's hard, but this is all we do, and our team is somewhere around 24 folks or so focused on getting this right. Where are we going right now? We're all across the state, as I said. As a partnership, we're in Portland, Gresham, Salem, Hillsborough. We're in suburban markets, I guess if you call that Corvallis or Cedar Mill or Estacada. Rural, we're in Mill City, Molalla, Staten, places that are challenging to build new housing, or this is the first time those cities have had new housing in decades. We're out in Frontier, Oregon, in Burns or Hines. And then we just finished something in Tillamook, and we'd love to be in Manzanita. Next year, we'll be applying for several new opportunities across Oregon and different markets. In each of these areas, it's all about local partnerships and local support, right? We don't just drop into a city and say, here's the thing. Every one of these markets, every one of these opportunities is because there's a city that wants us there, or there's folks like Jim and Rick that want us there, and there's nonprofit partners that want us there, and that's what makes it work. So we've got, I think, more than 20 active partnerships right now throughout the state. So that's really our focus, as strong partnerships. Where do we build? I think I already said that. But when we, are in these different markets, I think it's worth noting that it's not one size fits all. So we're working on how to, make sure that wherever we build, there's unique characteristics of the product. So we've got kind of different stylescapes, establishing characteristics that we want to build, and whether it's coastal or frontier, rural or urban, to obviously some of this is dictated by local, jurisdictional needs, but we're thinking about the way our interiors feel and exteriors feel and common rooms feel, depending on the location, obviously. A recent development that we just finished that Rick mentions called the Willet out in Tillamook. It's fairly small. It's not exactly apples to apples with what we're contemplating in Manzanita. There's a postage stamp size lot in Tillamook. This is a 3-story walk-up. They're not family units, but it was financed in a similar fashion that we are contemplating for the Manzanita opportunity. So that's unique, and it's the same developers. So, we're proud of this. We think it's a neat little deal. It's Earth Advantage Gold certified. It has 9-foot ceilings, so when you walk into a unit, even though they're fairly small, they feel good, nice. They have quartz counters and luxury vinyl tile flooring, stainless appliances, ports for air conditioning, EV charging, for solar ready. So we think it's a nice product. It already has over 100 people on the waiting list. And it was just built this summer. So it's a really good reflection of how hard it is for folks who are workforce, to find a place to live in Tillamook County. How do we build it? Unfortunately, it's just not all about land use, right? If you say you can build it, that's not enough. We've got to just go out and win highly competitive funds, right? If you say rock and roll, build it. Okay, now we've got to go compete against all these other jurisdictions and other developers that are competing for scarce resources statewide. So it's tough. We try to pair tax credits with funding from the state. Whatever it takes, we borrow as much money as we can. The more money we can borrow, the better we can build. Right now, borrowing money is not great. So we can borrow less than we want to, which means we need to ask for more. So we will need to piece together support from the county and anything from the city we can find, and little nonprofits, whatever it takes to piece together the capital stack to make this work, right? Because the whole point is we're restricting rents at 60% or 80%, depending on if it's affordable or workforce. So the only way to make that work is you've got to capture that delta with tax credits, with money from the state, and sometimes also money from the county. We can't have everything. We can't build to the level of quality that we want and that you want, and have reduced rents and not find some subsidy from somewhere. So that's the approach. We've been very successful as an organization. All those deals I just mentioned, they were all competitively funded, and all of them had some sort of skin in the game from a city or a county or something to make it work. So we'll be working on that model, but obviously we won't do it until we get the thumbs up that it'll be approved from a land use perspective. This is what we're contemplating. It's just sort of an aerial rendering. You can see, the hillside's a little dramatic there, but you can see the way that the buildings would come together, and there'd be a lovely kind of community room in the center. This is just a concept layout. Our architect is named Polyphon. They're fabulous, very creative, very smart, very talented. You can just kind of see it's a nice sort of elegant layout, the way that would work. And obviously all this is a concept, right? Just to sort of get us thinking about how much it would cost and what sort of level of support there would be for it. This is a concept site plan. We're happy to share any of these materials, of course. We're thinking about 60 units. For our model, we build in 12 plexes. What we're looking to do is try to find the most efficient product that's also lovely. The way we're trying to do that is through these sort of 12 plexes that can be oriented in nice ways. That helps us get to these family units that we know are very important and still have green space and amenities and a 2-to-1 parking ratio. We think that parking ratio is probably pretty important because we don't think people are going to want or able to park on Loop Road, that road there, right? So we've got to kind of contain it on the site. So this is, again, sort of an early concept that has been poured over by architects and surveyors and civil engineers to just see what we could do and to help us kind of price that out. A floor plan, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units, again, with 9-foot ceilings, washer and dryers in units. 1.5 bathrooms, typically. They're nice layouts. They're not huge. They're not small. They're just sort of everything a family would need to thrive. And these are just drafts, right? But you can see there's a breezeway in the center. Folks come up, they have their own, there's no corridor, there's no elevators, but they'd all have a nice view, and they would feel, I think, like a home despite being an apartment. Concept elevations, so don't get married to these, right? These are really for feedback from folks. You can see the kind of elevations and basic renders of kind of the breezeway approach. The cladding we would assume to be shingle, most likely a fiber cement shingle versus cedar, but we'd be open to cedar if we could afford it. A kind of elegant or interesting roof line to kind of complement all the kind of natural features in the area. And we think it'd be lovely. So as Rick mentioned, the building height as a 3-story walk-up with 9-foot ceilings would certainly exceed your max height right now of 28.5. That is, I think, well understood by folks. You can't get to 3 stories without going over 30 feet, really. But we think when you see this against, what it would look like with the character of the neighborhood, it seems reasonable to us in terms of the context of the neighborhood. It seems like from a your sight lines would be lovely, I think, and maintain the character of the neighborhood and the community that's so important in Manzanita. It's also important for folks to know, because I know that bringing 60 units to a small community can be scary for some folks. So just knowing that everything that we do will be professionally not only managed on site by property management, but our company, we have an asset manager. We manage more than 1,000 units overseeing our portfolio. There's no short-term rentals. Everything is deed restricted. So this is something we take seriously. Folks would have to qualify for the housing just like they would any market rate housing. So that's obviously important to us to keep the site operating at a high level. So should you say, yeah, this all sounds pretty great, guys, you should probably move forward with this, what we would do is begin our schematic design really to support our application work, right? So pulling everything together, what is it going to be, how much is going to cost, and how are we going to get funded? We would hope that in the November Planning Commission meeting, there'd be approvals or whatever is needed to be able to have confidence in making these investments. We've already invested an incredible amount of time and resources, even just getting this far, without even knowing if we're funded or approved by you to come and do this work. So all of that is really towards an application that will start in December and January. We'll submit next March, and next June, if everything works out, we'd find out we were funded and we'd be able to break ground maybe that fall because we'd be so far teed up. So that would be our goal. We need a lot of things to go right. We need you to be interested in this. We need the state to be interested in this. We need a bank to give us a rate that's not starting with a 7. We need a lot of stuff to go right, and I think we can pull it off, but it does take a lot of local support. So that's the outline, and happy to answer any questions or to send anybody any information that would be helpful.
Any questions from the commission?
I have a quick question. Well, I have lots of questions, but this can be Ben or Rick. What is you're going to want us to give you a higher density and relief for hopefully only height and not setbacks on that. Are you going to present that prior to the application for further discussion, or is that just all going to happen in the application process?
John, you'll have to forgive me, but my screen froze up just at the time you were starting your question. I apologize. Would you mind repeating?
Well, I unmuted this time, Rick. Okay, let me start again.
I'm sorry.
First of all, being against affordable housing or workforce housing is kind of like being against puppies. So I think I'm on board with it. I think it is a need, and but as a city and a planning commissioner, still a lot of questions. It looked like you were going to ask for relief on height, which seems obvious with a 3-story walk-up. I couldn't tell from the site plan. I was looking for orientation on that site plan. I think the site plan was oriented with north to the right, but Ben will have to throw it back up and maybe agree or disagree that my interpretation was somewhere close, but it didn't look like you were asking for relief on any of the setbacks, but height and density are going to be an issue. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to your question about the cadence of how that is going to be requested, I'll defer to Rick and the local judgment about the best way how that's going to be presented.
Yeah, I could maybe even offer. Oh, go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
No, Lola, please.
So we've been working with this team for quite a bit, and there's a couple of actions that they'll need to take. And the first is Half of this is zoned R2. So there's a rezoning application that would be part of this, and it would probably all come in as a package. So a rezoning to the SRR, which would allow them to use the PUD process. And then there would be a variance for height and then a variance for density. So, and then there would also be an annexation request because this is outside into the urban growth boundary. Did I get that right, gentlemen?
Yes.
Yes.
You're not asking for any relief on parking or any other issues. It's just density and height.
Correct.
Yes, that's correct.
That's
John.
correct. And while it's certainly, it's meaningful, I think it's worth noting that, land's hard to come by across the state, not just in Manzanita. So when we're doing this work in other cities, it's typically we're asking for a lot of the same. We have comparable needs, right? So it's not altogether unique that we need a jurisdiction to work with us to make affordable housing work.
Ben, is the east property, is the east boundary of the proposed property the urban growth boundary?
Here, I'll defer to you here, Rick. I don't want to get anything wrong as it relates to local land.
Yeah, currently the city property ends basically at the current end of the Highlands development. And in fact, we had an annexation for part of our phase 5 of Highlands. And looking on this map, you can see the curved road that Ben's got called Loop Road there. As you go to the right, that road will loop directly west. So north, to answer your question, John, north is basically due right on this. Okay. And then the road loops from the west. And by the way, that road is already there with a hammerhead on it in the Highlands development. It would continue from the west to the east, loop right here, and then continue on straight down to Nacarney, which would also and Jim, who is he's the infrastructure guru. He has this thing planned out pretty well. That if it gets approved and if it's something that the city wants, the location for an entrance to it would be off of Nacarney City and situated in a nice place. So you could get in and out without having to drive through, take a circuitous path through neighborhoods or whatnot. It's a fairly straight deal. And phase 3 and 2 and 3 or 3 would continue along that road toward Nacarney. So it makes for a nice private setting.
Is the east boundary of the proposed development adjacent to the urban growth boundary of the city?
Jim, you would know that.
Yes, John, it is. Our property line is not at the most easterly line of the UGB. It's close, I believe. Layla or Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Clipper Court is in the UGB.
Okay, I guess basically that was my question.
Right, it's the that's really the end of the UGB. We go almost to that, but not all the way to it.
Okay.
Sorry, I saw Phil's hand raised. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this is for any of the folks who are presenting. Have you done a study with regards to what you consider would be the impact of the traffic that would be added with this development?
Jim, want to answer that?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, again, we realize we're going to have that without question. And we will complete that and have that ready prior to our application. Hopefully that we can bring to you in November of this year.
Okay. Jim, it looks like from a plan that I saw that you're planning on, is part of the traffic going to pass through the Highlands area and then the rest of it going to connect with Neacarny Road?
Correct. Yes.
Have you had it?
It will flow through, but most likely because of where it's located, they're going to go out to Neacarny and either go left or right to get, to 101 to come over to the lumber yard, or go right to go to Classic Street, or around to the other side of Manzanita, I would guess.
Have you had any discussions with Tillamook County with regards to improvement on Neacarny Road?
Have not.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I saw Bert a minute ago, and then we'll go to Lee.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your ambition. These are hard projects to make happen, so good for you guys. A question on the total build out and number of units, and I think Leila might be able to help with the procedure, but there would be presumably a zone change, annexation, variance, all the stuff that you identified for the entire property. So they wouldn't have to come back every time with subsequent phases. But the specific question is a little bit on the total build out, and if the units would all be targeted at family units, or would there be some other mixes of units potentially?
I don't know, Leila, if you want to answer, but I can answer this. The initial number that we're using, and Jim, you may want to comment on the density piece of it, is that we're looking at, I believe the number is what, 13 or 13.5 per acre is considered a high
13.
density. 13. So if you look at this whole, the entire site for all three phases is approximately 10 acres, Bert. So we're looking at staying within that number when it's built out. So say 130 would be the maximum allowed if it were that high density. We're looking at staying within that for that entire. And in terms of the product, that's still being looked at, but to stay within 130, you couldn't have a cluster like we're looking at right now of these multifamily. You could have maybe a cluster of 2 to 4 plexes. You could have something that's more lined up along the street. You could have a number of things, but we'd probably have to go to the 2 to 4 plexes down the road that would appeal maybe to a higher percentage of mean family income or whatever. That's still kind of in the planning stage. However, the one thing that is for certain is this needs to be targeted at the workforce. So that would be there's no market rate or single family homes planned within the 10 acres, at least not currently, and that has not been the plan or discussed, frankly.
Yeah, it's obviously extremely challenging to deliver this for folks. I think the question I have is maybe just the question is it targeted specifically at families, or would there be potentially small units for single people or whatever?
I think I can answer that. It's just
okay,
one way to look at that is that the first phase we're contemplating and the funding from the state is really competitively weighted towards family units, right? So that there is no project without that source of funds. The next phase, we would have a little bit more liberty and more freedom to have more of a diverse income, or rather unit mix, right? For studios, 1s, 2s, 3s, whatever be needed. So, but we don't have that option on the first opportunity. It's really family driven. Family is defined by anything over two average of 2 bedrooms. So We typically average 2.01 to make sure we're getting all the points from the state to try to get the funding.
Okay, well, that's great. Obviously, the family housings, they're super hard housing to deliver. So, okay.
Lee, did you have your hand up?
I did. Thank you, Karen. So, Ben, first off, you mentioned that you anticipate being able to bring this back to the Planning Commission, and your early planning stage seems to be void of a lot of specifics. Not without a lot of effort on all your parts, Jim and Rick, but have you done a pre-app yet with the city?
Yes, actually we have a couple of them actually, but not a formal pre-app like we will have to go through.
Okay, thank you.
There's a lot of planning involved in it, and I think everyone is aware of it.
Well, I certainly am. There's no
I know you are, Lee.
These kind of projects are very difficult, as Bert mentioned, to bring all the pieces together. And I guess I'm going to ask Ben again. It seemed like I looked up your application to LIFT, and it seemed like that the average unit size was going to be 2.65 bedrooms. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think on this one we had local feedback that the one thing that was missing, so that's a great point. So yes, I believe that is correct. We can do whatever we want on another application. We can reduce that down if we want. One thing that makes LIFT funding, which is PS, the only game in town, right? So if you've heard of Governor Kotek's initiative for affordable housing and workforce housing development, it is almost exclusively funded through this program called LIFT. We are evaluated on our application based on telling the state how we're responding to local need. There are not that many nonprofits in Tillamook County, right? It's certainly different than building in an urban area where you've got 500 nonprofits and it's easy to sort of take their temperature. What we heard from outreach to local nonprofits was there's no like capital F family units, 3 bedrooms and 4 bedrooms don't exist in the county. So that skewed our unit mix a little bit more in Manzanita, where you see there's a few 4-bedroom units, which I don't think there's any in the county, and 3. So that's what got that a little bit higher than our normal average of 2.01.
Okay, you mentioned, Ben, that your discussions with folks in the area indicated that that was an appropriate consideration. Who did you talk to?
The nonprofit in the area, and please forgive me because it's the Latino Serving Nonprofit, and if I mess it up, I'm gonna feel awful. So you have to let me Google it because I tried to get their support for almost 9 months, and they ended up not giving us said support. Sorry. I can Google it while we talk. The actual name of their organization. Give me a moment.
You talked to some private entities, though, outside the government controls. Is that correct?
Yeah, and frankly, yes. We felt like Consejo Hispano. Sorry, I did not want to get it wrong. We talked to, Tillamook County commissioners. We obviously just did all this work in Tillamook, and then frankly, working with Rick and Jim, we feel like was representing a lot of the local need or local input or local perspective as well.
Do you have any idea? Thank you for that. Do you have any idea what the area median income is?
I do. Yeah, I can pull it up fairly quickly if that'd be helpful.
Lee, are you talking about Tillamook County or Manzanita?
Well, that's a good question, Rick. It's obviously considerably different, and that's what I'm curious about, because your measuring stick for allowing folks to participate in this program is going to be either 60%, or in some cases, I read in the LIFT application, 30% of the area median income.
Yeah, so
that was going to be limited to only 6 units, as I recall.
The 2023 median income for Tillamook County is $76,000.
So would that be a stick that you would apply to this project, or would you use something more area oriented, such as North Tillamook County?
Well, I want to be really clear. I don't do any of this. This is all HUD in the state, and we do what we would do in every other affordable housing developer does, right? Which is tell us what the rents are in each county with the appropriate rent restriction that is tied to our funding. In this case, it'd be 60% area median income. LIFT funding uses Article Q bonds from the state, and it's statutory that it cannot exceed 60%. So that's our limit. That's our deal. Now, sometimes at 60%, you also say, well, geez, some folks are working workforce jobs. Maybe they're working and they actually aren't even making 60%. So you want to also have a mix of some 30% units as well. So you're actually serving everybody, folks who are working on the farm or folks who are, are even lower income, where there's maybe 2 or 3 kids, only one person working, one person watching the kids. So you really want to be able to serve some 30% units as well, whenever you can. To Rick's earlier point, we are not contemplating any vouchers on this site as Section 8 vouchers, other than anybody who would walk in and we'd be obligated to say, yes, we'll rent to anybody. So yeah, we're looking at a range of incomes between 30 and 60, just like any other affordable housing development in the state.
I was just
I'll just note real quickly, just for folks, that the state determines what area median income is, and it's usually based on the county's area median income, and it also adjusts based on household size. So it's just something to think about. So we wouldn't use like Manzanita local income. It would be area median income, and that's actually a defined term.
That's right. And it changes every year. And we sit by like complete nerds waiting for HUD to update it. And then when they update it, we change our pro formas and then we do it again the next year, right? So it's very prescriptive. It dictates what we can and can't rent units for. And then next year it'll be different. The year after it'll be different too, in terms of what the amount is.
And just so you know too, our tax abatement program that the city passed last year also used the same table for determining income levels. And so there's some consistency there.
Well, thank you. I think that between the presentation and some clarification from Layla, that you've answered my questions and concerns. So thank you.
Cool.
One last piece that I just want to get in here before we stop, and the people who have been involved with me on this, and Jim as well, know how seriously we take this. And I will just ask 2 questions: if not us, who? And if not now, when? It's got to get done.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, just to kind of what Rick was saying to Jim and Ben also, just to commend you for trying to solve a very severe problem, not only here in Manzanita, but countywide, statewide. It really is something that I'm excited to see that you guys are addressing. I heard many people say it's difficult. Yes. But after seeing that presentation and understanding what Ben's position is and what they do, it's difficult, but it's certainly doable. And I hope we can do it.
Rock and roll. Thank you, Frank.
Yes.
Thank you.
I just have one quick question. I'm sorry, before we go, and that's about ownership. You're not intending to condominiumize any of these. It's all going to be 100% rental.
100% rental and owned in perpetuity and deed restricted for a quadrillion years. Or we would owe the state back all the money they gave us to build it, right? So that's not feasible, right? So yeah, these are owner held for a long time. When they're tax credit projects, they're owned by some nameless, faceless investor for 15 years, but we are the ones who, for all purposes and intents, own the property.
Okay, so you'll be responsible for ongoing maintenance and
100%. That was my point about we have an asset management team that's overseeing our property managers, and so we have a very professional approach to management that I think is helpful for communities that are maybe a little unsure about new developments.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Any other comments? Any instruction?
And I'd just like to add that, just in case it wasn't clear, the deed restriction would be for the whole 10 acres, not just phase one. So we're talking the 10 acres, so that, Rick and I, our whole team is looking at it like this particular 10 acres is used for this purpose, nothing else. Okay?
Go ahead, Bert.
Just a quick question. Based on that, the zone change and PUD application, this is maybe a lighter question, would be for the entire project with a PUD application for the entire project, all the phases, so that you'd have the maximum flexibility of how to distribute open space and stuff, or would you get the zone change, then have, say, 3 PUD applications? That's probably a question to several folks.
Layla, you want me to?
Why don't you start?
Yeah, try that. Normally what would happen, or the way we're looking at it, is we would have phase one, we'd have an application for that. The zone change or overlay for the 10 acres would need an approval to change the zone, obviously. Then we're going to have to cluster the homes. And you know what that means. We cluster them. That means that we have to have 40% open space. And we got to talk about what's a park. Okay? Sorry, but we do. And so if that's the case, the way I see it and the way I did Classic Street Cottages is we got the zone overlay, but I had to come in with an application separately for phase 1, 2, and 3. And I'm guessing that's what we would have to do now, correct, Layla?
Yes, and that's what we've talked about, largely due to the fact that we don't entirely know what phase 2 and 3 look like. And so we want the team to be able to have the flexibility to determine that based on all the elements that go into a project like this, financing, all of that. So it would be, I think what we've discussed is it would be a zone change application for the entire 10 acres, then a PUD application for phase 1. And that's why we're talking about a variance for density, because phase 1, I think the overall plan will smooth out to about 13 units to the acre, but it looks like it might be a little higher for phase 1. So that's why staff is recommending that they do a variance application for phase 1. And then that doesn't restrict if financing changes. If things change, they're not tied to a plan that isn't fully thought out for phases 2 and 3. But the zone change would be based on that concept of it being income restricted housing. So the deed restriction would apply to the whole 10 acres.
Correct.
Any other comments? Suggestions? Okay, well, we look forward to seeing what comes in November.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks,
Everybody. Good night.
All right, thanks.
Okay, and that leads us to how we need to spend the last half an hour or 35 minutes of our time today talking about open space and parks.
Yeah. So I have a presentation I'd like to go through. That's okay. And then hope inspire some conversation among the commission. So I'm going to just switch to my presentation.
Yep.
Okay. Do y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay. So let me just get my screen sorted up here so I can see everybody. All right. So we're talking about 40% set aside. And I'm going to go through kind of a whole bunch of stuff. And then at the end, just leave it open for conversation. As Karen said, we're about down to about 30, 35 minutes. So we can also continue the conversation to the next commission meeting. Specifically, we're talking about the standard at MZO 3.0304A, that the overall density in the SRR zone is 6.5 dwelling units per gross acre. Dwellings may be clustered on one portion of the site within the SRR zone to achieve a maximum density of 13 dwelling units per acre, where at least 40% of the total lot or parcel area is reserved or dedicated as permanent open space as a public or private park area or golf course. So I think all of you know this by heart now, but let's just put it up here for good measure. I also wanted to note that we have additional guidance in here with respect to multifamily, and this may very well come up with respect to the discussion we just had, which is an MZO 4.060. We have multifamily or apartment siting criteria where at least 50% of the required open space area is usable by the residents. So this can be in the form of lawns, outdoor play areas, swimming pools, patios, or decks, or where the Planning Commission permits indoor areas such as recreation rooms, meeting areas, or indoor swimming pools. I just wanted to bring that to your attention because that means that the other 50% can be something else. And that could be passive open space, for example. So I thought it would be helpful to provide, many of you are new to the Planning Commission, and also for folks that are watching, kind of how I don't know if you guys remember, but how a bill becomes a law, and that little paper guy that was on the Capitol steps at Schoolhouse Rock. So how does an application come before the Planning Commission, and what does staff do? So we rely on the zoning ordinance, and we also rely on the plain meaning of the language if there's no definition. And then we also rely on previous decisions or precedents. So that's the information we use to advise the applicant on what to submit that ultimately leads to the drafting of findings that then gets presented in a staff report to the Planning Commission. That's how we also determine whether or not an application is complete. So I did want to go through the 40% standard. So we have talked about this a lot and think to give you some perspective of how staff landed on approving at least an application as well as the deeming it complete. So the prior precedent is really Ordinance 1201, which is Classic Street cottages. That was the only time that the SRR zone applied the 40% clustering standard. At that time, staff, the Planning Commission, and the City Council interpreted that requirement to mean open space. And the plan that was submitted was included the gross area calculations for open space on that site. And you all have seen this, but just for good measure, this is the application. This is what was submitted. This is what was actually adopted as part of Ordinance 1201 and is the open space plan for classic cottages. And I want to note this includes like a slope area. That's a delta of 20 feet. This is landscaped area. There are strips of open space along the parking area, but all of this was included into a gross area calculation. I wanted to point out too, just sort of kind of giving some folks some background, if they're not a planner like me, like what clustering development is, what's the intent. We had a lot of questions during the land use process about whether it should be net or gross density, but it's gross. We look at gross density because the point of clustering residential development is to use the extra land as open space for recreation or agriculture. It can also just be used for generalized open space. And this is just a definition I pulled off of the interwebs. But really, kind of the purpose of clustering development is to promote an integrated site design that's considerate to the natural features and topography. So that can include just leaving a natural area so that when people look out their window, they see a beautiful, there's a series of trees and it's a slope, and that can still be considered open space. to protect environmentally sensitive areas of the development site, and as well as to permanently preserve natural features. In some cases, it's prime agricultural land. So if you're familiar with Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, that was really the intent of that back. That's sort of theoretical, but that was really kind of the starting point of clustering development in open space. It minimizes non-point source pollution because it reduces the area of impervious surface. And it's really, its primary purpose is to create more open space for recreation and social interaction. I thought it would be helpful, since we talked a lot about parks, to talk about Manzanitas parks, and they come in all shapes and sizes. So I pulled ones that were noted in Manzanitas Park Plan from 2011. But first is really our big park on 3rd Street, and that is the 7.5 acre site, 6 of which is undeveloped and includes wetlands. So there's some development of the site. There's you can see from the aerial photo here, there's a tennis court, there's some playground area, but most of this stuff is inaccessible and it is undeveloped, and it does include some wetland areas. Another area that's been identified as a park and also has significant slope. So I don't have a topo map on here, but this is very sloped, and this is actually up by the Public Works building. There's a reservoir on here. This is an undeveloped park. That shouldn't say 7.5 acres, 6 undeveloped. Sorry about that. And then there's this other area too that's been defined as a future park, but it's also currently just natural open space. I call this the Funky Triangle Park. This is also an area that's been in our park plan called park, and it is undeveloped natural area. We also have our basketball court, which is adjacent to the public safety building over off Lanita and 5th Avenue, and that's primarily a developed park. We also have this little pocket park, and it has a bench. That's also considered a park, and it's very tiny. So just to give you some context of what are we calling parks in Manzanita, and this idea of a 40% set aside. So staff went and looked at 25 Oregon coast jurisdictions, and we found that only 3 had a definition of a park. 8 jurisdictions had definitions for a park, but it was specific to city-owned assets or public parks. And most of these were related to the capital improvement plan. And then 14 jurisdictions had no definition of a park. And I actually checked in with some colleagues, one who's got 30 plus years in planning and code writing, and he was like, I'd never seen a definition of a park in a code, and I've never written a code with a park. So it's not often defined. So we're not that horribly behind the scene here. So just thought that would be helpful context for folks to know. So what did folks define as a park? Clatsop County said yes, but only in terms of lands accepted as a county park. The cities of Astoria, Warrenton, and Seaside do not have definitions of a park. The city of Cannon Beach does, but it's specific to parks owned by the city. Tillamook County does not have a park definition. The city of Rockaway Beach does, but they did have but they had a definition of public space. But we're talking also about private space when we're talking about the 40%, which is really what we're talking about. Lincoln City, Lincoln County, no. City of Depot Bay does, but again, it's focused on public facilities or assets. The city of Newport does not, but it does have code provisions for a park. And then the city of Waldport, yes, but only in terms, again, of public facilities or assets. The city of Florence does, but they define parklands. And this is a very broad definition. And you can read it here. The Dune City, we also looked at Douglas County, had a definition, an open or enclosed tract of land set apart, devoted for the pleasure, recreation, ornament, light and air for the general public, or in the case of private development, for invited guests or controlled use access. The city of Reedsport did have a definition, but that is really, again, focused on city-owned. Coos County did not, but they did have a definition of what is considered common open space. And I just want to flag that because that was something that stood out to staff. But these are land or facilities which are shared by all the individual owners of a PUD or recreational plan PUD and managed generally by the HOA. It could include undeveloped land, parks, tennis courts, pools, etc. The city of North Bend does not, but it does have its code that's specific to parks, and again, municipal parks. City of Coos Bay, again, focused on public parks. City of Bandon did not. Curry County did not. Port Orford did, but only in terms, again, of cities, a city park. And then the city of Gold Beach was focused on anything that gets is related to capital improvement. And the city of Brookings, no. So what staff in our discussions and looking at this, just putting forward for your consideration, is suggesting that we drop the language that speaks specifically to a public or private park area. So this is interesting, right? Park area, not park, but park area. Is that a park? Or golf course. And we're recommending that Planning Commission remove that language from the zoning ordinance and then to provide staff with more clarity on how to apply the standard. So that when we're working with applicants, just like the folks that presented prior to this discussion, we're giving them good direction on what to submit in terms of completing their application. If we need a definition, the Planning Commission feels strongly that it's important. I think it's important to consider the utility of that definition, particularly when the language is broad. So all the definitions that we provided, and we'll send and post to the website the summary of the different options or the 25 cities we looked at, so you have that. But does it help? And we also have to be really clear. It needs to be clear and objective, particularly as it relates to housing. So there is no subjectivity in that, and that's related to Oregon's housing rules. And we need to consider how we clearly and objectively define open space. Staff would recommend you make it specific to the PUD if you do want to define it, and the 40% design standard or the 50% standard for mixed use. And we recommend looking at the definition that was provided, looking at common open space. We liked that definition of Coos County, should you require a definition. Staff believe, though, that if you sort of drop this language here, that provides the flexibility to provide a clear and objective standard. And another example is Douglas County, an open or enclosed tract of land set apart, devoted to the purposes of pleasure, recreation, ornament. So that would give you some broad, you could apply that broadly, light air for the general public, or in the case of private development for invited guests. So just some food for thought. So staff is really recommending that you consider eliminating park area and golf course from the definition. That if you want to establish a new definition, that the focus is on open space for meeting the density standard, and you need to make it clear and objective, and provide staff with guidance on what your expectations are for a site plan at the submittal stage. And then finally, do you need a definition for a park if that's different than open space? So with that, I will hand it back over to the chair to facilitate a discussion, and both myself and Scott Fregonesi are available to answer any questions you might have.
So I guess my first question to start this off is, when you're talking about striking that language from our current ordinance, are you suggesting that we agree not to enforce that language going forward until we're ready to rewrite the code to meet whatever our new policies are with respect to open space?
Well, depending on how quickly, or if you quickly get to a decision, we could actually slip that into the TSP ordinance updates. We could just add that to that ordinance, or you would do as you've suggested, Karen, which is you provide staff with that guidance, and then that's how you interpret your findings when you get an application that has that. Because I will note that when you're working with applicants, and we often work with applicants for months, especially on big PUDs, to provide them guidance on what to submit. So that's where it's important, if Planning Commission is changing the direction and the precedent is different, then providing us with that guidance, we can then support the applicant in providing more complete application and giving Planning Commission information that you need to make that decision. So you could do it either that way, or you can, if there's consensus to strike that language, we can insert that into the ordinance for updating the zoning ordinance for the transportation policies.
Go ahead, Frank.
Oh, I like Douglas County and Coos County, as I was making notes before you guys recapped it at the end there. I think they were on to certainly be in the right ballpark for what we need. And I think if it's in the zoning ordinance and it says 40%, you still have to define what that 40% is. If we strike something from the ordinance, I think that makes total sense, because I don't even know why golf course gets landed in there. So the cottages could have put a small golf course on their property because it said golf course was available. I mean, that just seems foolhardy. So I do think that some of that language needs to be stricken from the ordinance and then redefined based on a lot of the things that Douglas and Coos County used to explain what that space might be. Because if you leave it in the ordinance unexplained, we're going to be sitting here every time there's an application going, well, what is it? What do they mean? What can they do? What can't they do?
Go ahead, John, jump in.
We have in our zoning ordinance setback requirements for just about every zone. It seems to me that, that requirement should be, well, I don't know whether it should be overlaid, or do we automatically include everything outside of the building setback as part of the open space? Because, I mean, ultimately that's what it becomes in every zone. If we use the R2 zoning, you've got the 5 or the 8 foot setback on the sides, the 10 in the back, 20 in front. We also have guidelines for the allowable area requirements for our sites in town. So, I mean, where are the different boundaries and how do they overlay on one another? And Layla, you may have or Scott, you may have some expertise or some, history with such a thing. I'm not sure I do.
Well, and Scott can jump in here too, but the intent and purpose behind setbacks really is to maintain some measure of open space, right? So that the whole site isn't covered in impervious surfaces. So, and I think the prior precedent, which is Classic Street Cottages, that was included in the overall open space calculation. So I think there's some benefit to including that, because some of those setbacks can be pretty significant. They also allow the homeowners or the residents to be able to look out into area that is not developed. Scott, do you have anything you would add to that?
Oh, you're right on. I think that just the intent of those setbacks is to create open space on the lot. But this is more specific to the PUD for the purpose of the definition. Because you wouldn't need to, but it would help actually to have the definition of common open space, even if it was just in terms of the area of the setback.
Well, if our intent is to include it in the area of open space for the purposes of general zoning or for PUD, we probably ought to say that.
Well, you're not going to hit 40% though.
It's more than impervious surface. I mean, it's light and openness between buildings and as well. So I'm in favor of open space, and I think we can just go ahead and roll it into or say that becomes part of the open space.
Frank, you wanted to jump in, Frank?
Oh, no, he explained it. I was a little bit confused, but I'm good now.
Okay. Go ahead, Bert.
Yeah, I think you found the solution in just a little strike through there. Getting rid of those words really simplifies the whole code. And then I agree that coming up with a good definition of open space, then will be make things a lot easier in the interpretation. So I think the question is, how much detail do you go into? I would agree that typically the setbacks and things like that are included in an overall open space classification. But I guess the multifamily actually has somewhat of a definition about 50% and 50%. So for recreational use, and maybe that can be applied to the PUD. Maybe that's what you were implying, Layla. I think the other things would be minimum dimensions. And so, the intent of a PUD is obviously to cluster the development and aggregate the space. So you actually do have open space and you increase the density. So I'm a fan of it. I think question is a 5-foot landscaped element in a parking lot meeting the intent of an open space ordinance? So I think the commission should have a discussion about the fine detail. Is there a minimum dimension or whatever associated with that? Another thought is passive and active open space. And I have seen that in different codes that those are defined. And I guess the final comment is I don't think you need to have a definition of parks because if you strike it out of this portion of the ordinance, the only need for a definition of park would be that perhaps that it's a publicly owned, passive or active open space. So anyway, so I think the question is, I would agree to strike it. I think that's the cleanest method and the easiest, suggested by staff. And then maybe just try to work on that definition of open space so that it's clear for everyone.
If we're going to go 50-50 on residential or apartments, should we look at the 50% that's usable or for recreational facilities? Like, should it be flat, for instance? Or, I don't want to burden the developer with any specifics on what he should put on there, but, and I'm not even sure flat is a good definition for usable. And if we're going to put a gazebo, or if he's going to put a gazebo or something like that, that's still part of the, it's a impervious surface, but it's part of the recreational area. So I'd be in favor of including that, but I would like to see a discussion about, that 50-50 split. I think the 50 that's not used for, or usable space for, the residents can be what we're all talking about as open space. And it's just space used to let light and visual softness in and light and things like that.
Go ahead, Tom.
Like others, I'm in favor of excising park and open space, or park and golf course, because golf course is meaningless. Park is too hard to define. But I'm not willing to do that unless we have a much better definition of open space that includes some sense of contiguity. It has to be a set area. It cannot be what we saw, in the Manzanita lofts when they came back and just had an aggregation of all these little bits of spaces here and there, some of which were, 5 inches of dirt or 5 feet of dirt between the parking lot and Dorcas Lane, and add it all up and call that open space. It has to be something more than that. And I think if you went back to the slide Layla had that said these are the reasons for clustering, you could probably come up with some restrictions on what that open space would be. and something about, bunching it together. But I don't think we can at this point just take out park and golf course and let it go at that, because Stoops and there was in the Manzanita Lofts, they had a little tiny strip behind a couple of the buildings that altogether added up to 40%, but nobody would consider that an open space. It's just, typical of any structure.
Well, I will note that, and that's helpful feedback, and I think it's fine. But in the prior, so in Ordinance 1201, there are strips that are about 5 feet that were included in the total calculation for open space for the Classic Street cottages. And those are setbacks from the right-of-way and the parking area. So that is the prior precedent that was relied upon, I think, by the applicant to put forward those calculations. But that's certainly something that can be remediated if there is a more clear definition of open space, since this planning commission is taking a different interpretation of that. But I do want to note that by ordinance, we have accepted that previously.
Well, let me speak to that briefly, because it's not really a precedent if you didn't at the time address this issue. Is this adding up to 40% as park and golf course? I mean, if it wasn't considered as such as that time, it doesn't really bind us going forward.
Well, it was. I mean, they were putting forward the common open space as meeting that 40% standard. Yes, it was exactly for this area. Yes. And maybe Jim can actually speak to that, since it was his application.
I do have some comments on that, because I probably have more than comments. I have a question or two. When that was done, the idea, everybody at the time agreed what the purpose was for clustering, what the purpose was for setting aside this area, however it's configured, so that they want to concentrate on leaving trees, leaving landscape. Never did we look at or talk about usable space. I mean, I think if you're going to look at usable, I guess I'd ask the question, what is usable in your mind, or in each of our minds? What's usable? And if you go down that road, as an example, you brought up the strips that I had at Classic Street that were narrow and longer, or what have you, or a hillside, or the strip with the lofts, along the driveway there, or the road. That came up quite a few times as not usable. What if you had that strip along there and you had old growth trees all the way along that? Would you look at that as usable? Would you look at that as something you want to include?
That's what we need to figure out. I mean, is a parking lot usable? It's certainly open. Is any piece of the property where you don't have a building sitting on it, does that qualify as open? That's if that's what we're going to by dropping park and golf course, then I'm not willing to go along with that. I want open space to be something more in keeping with the goals that Layla pointed out, why you have this, to have a recreational opportunity, to have, a place to go and socially interact or recreate or do something. I don't want to take out park if that's the only thing keeping somebody from saying, yeah, my open space is this asphalt parking lot.
Well, that obviously wouldn't be included because the intent is natural area and to reduce impervious surface. So if it's a parking lot, that will be excluded. But part of one of the 4 items that when I mentioned cluster development, and there's more, is looking at preservation of important natural features. So if you had a hillside with trees and you preserved that, included it in your open space, that's a question for the commission. Would that count as potentially open space because you're preserving that natural area? It may not be quote unquote usable, but you are preserving a natural feature which is usable by wildlife. It can be part of a wildlife corridor. I agree 100% that a parking lot doesn't count as open space, but undisturbed land, so 6 acres of our park is undisturbed open space that's inaccessible. It's just refining that. So I just want to be clear, no one's suggesting that parking lots should be included in that calculation.
Well, the only reason it will not be included in that calculation is if you define open space in the way you just described. If you just
it's
leave
natural area.
If you just leave the term open space sitting there, anyone will look at that and say open space is anything there isn't a building by definition. That's why I want those descriptions put in.
Can you bring
and that's why we were really attracted to Coos County and to Douglas County. They both had good definitions of open space.
I just want to call attention to the fact that we're at 5:56. We basically have 4 more minutes of this discussion. So we're really trying hard to keep these meetings to 2 hours. Bert, I know you had a comment. Why don't you go ahead and make that really quick, and then let's continue this after we've all had a chance to read. You said you'll put your presentation on the website. Is that right? So that we can look at. And Scott, you look like you have something you want to say too. So let me go first to Bert and then to Scott, and then let's wind it up.
Yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction. And so getting the definition, and in most zoning codes that I'm used to is there's a, open space definition, but there's also required active kind of recreation space, which becomes the developed component of a site plan.
Right.
And, that would be, a green field to play soccer with for kids or, whatever it is. And you definitely want to keep the natural areas, wetlands, things like that into the definition of open space. So I would suggest, wasn't there in the multifamily section some kind of a definition of those two or something?
That was the 50-50 split that Layla was talking about earlier.
Yeah, so maybe that can be the nugget or the chassis to build off of for PUDs.
Layla, is the classic street cottages going to be part of the thing you put on the website?
Yeah, I'll just put this whole presentation up, and it has the definitions, and it also has a link to each of the zoning ordinance we looked at.
Okay.
And one, Chair, if I may, what we could do is staff, I feel like we have a good sense of direction that, if I'm reading the room correctly, there's some consensus around a definition for open space. And perhaps if the Planning Commission can take some time to look at those definitions, you can send staff your feedback between now and next meeting, and we could try to draft the beginning of a definition for discussion for our next meeting. So if I could take the liberty of tasking the Planning Commission to provide staff with some direction maybe in the next 2 weeks. So by Labor Day, you could give us your feedback on those definitions. If there are specific things that you want to see, then staff can take a crack at drafting a definition for discussion, because I think the sooner we have some clarity on that, the better we will be able to serve our community members who will be coming in for an application on this maybe as early as November. So if that's okay with you, Chair, and the rest of the commissioners, that's what I would recommend we do. And then we can continue this discussion at the Planning Commission meeting in September.
That sounds good to me. Any objections to having staff stab at it? Scott, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay, great. With that, we have just 1 minute to find out what's happening at our September and October meetings.
Aaron, if we're going to have an application for an extension for Steeplejack, they're going to be asking for an extension for both the projects.
Okay, is that it?
That right now is all I have on my schedule.
For September?
Right, and then we can talk about parks again.
Good. We'll definitely be doing that.
And we can kick off our discussion about the TSP ordinance as well. So you have two homework assignments.
Yeah. So the TSP discussion, we should really start diving in deeply to make sure and, to really review the ordinance, so, the suggested language for changes to the ordinance, because it would be really great to get that underway and actually be able to say that we've completed a section of our comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance by the end of 2023.
On that point, Leila, would you like comments to you on the ordinance ahead of?
Please.
Okay.
Yes, if you have them, and then we'll cover them all in the meeting. And my guess is that we'll have 2 meetings. We'll start the discussion in September, continue it in October, and ideally be ready to make a recommendation at the end of the meeting in October.
And if the chair would allow me one more question. In the ordinance, are there any environmentally critical areas or steep slope ordinance provisions in the current code?
There is with respect to things like determining building height, but I can't say off the top of my head.
If maybe that's something, not for next meeting or whether, but overall, I think that might be a useful thing to take a look at.
Okay. Anything else before we say adios? Okay, then I'm going to declare the meeting ended.
Hey,
well done, Karen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Scott.